Been a very interesting week. The earth burped and told us who was boss again. It's nice that keeps reminding us of that. I was last here in Eugene at this conference in 1987, so I think it's been sufficient time for people to forget how much I offended them, and that's why I'm back. I'd like to give a warning that I'll probably be saying things that people don't like to hear. That's my job, to piss people off. I'm not here to wallow in your approval. I'm not here to win any personality contests. You all have opinions of me. I don't really care what they are. That's just the way it is. I know who my enemy is. It's you, and it's I. It's the whole human species, this overly glorified, conceited, naked ape that's a divine legend in its own mind, totally obsessed with self-gratification and controlled by illusions. Because I'm here tonight to talk to you about The Matrix. You may have seen the movie. I'm here to talk about the real thing. The matrix that we live in, which is the media culture that we live in. Because everything you think, everything you do is defined and controlled by the media, which controls all of us. The media defines reality. And that's why our species is on a one-way track to receiving a collective Darwin Award when we deliver ourselves into the oblivion of extinction. And the only way we're going to get around that is by understanding just what kind of trap we're in. In 1972, I attended the United Nations Conference on the Environment, which was held in Stockholm, and young people from around the world came there to listen to their world leaders tell us what we had to do. They said that the Earth was in serious trouble unless we were prepared to take a very aggressive and passionate stand in its defense, then we wouldn't have much hope. That's what our world leaders were telling us in 1972. And we listened to those leaders and we went out and did exactly what they told us to, only to have them tell us that we were too aggressive or too passionate, when we weren't really very aggressive at all. The number one issue on the agenda at that conference in '72 was the problem of out-of-control human population growth. And I attended the UN meeting in '92 in Rio de Janeiro, the UN Conference on the Environment and Development this time. The Secretary General was a great environmentalist with great credentials, Maurice Strong, former president of Petro-Canada. But we had learned a lot. I mean, the world's population had increased by 1.4 billion, I think, during that period of time. And the issue of out-of-control human population growth wasn't even on the agenda in '92 for fear of offending the Catholic host nation of Brazil and the Vatican. But one of the issues that was discussed was biodiversity. The single greatest problem on this planet right now is the destruction of biodiversity and the extinction of species of plants and animals, and the single cause for that is out-of-control human population growth. They were going to discuss the problem, but not the cause of the problem. And I attended a conference, a panel discussion on the issue of biodiversity, and at a UN conference on the environment, you would expect to listen to some experts on the issue. And that's when it really came home to me, the kind of culture that we lived in. Because at a UN conference on the environment, the panel of experts on the issue of biodiversity were Jeremy Irons, Jerry Brown, John Denver, and Shirley MacLaine. Recently, I wrote a speech for Pierce Brosnan. I write his environmental speeches, and this one had to do with NATO. He called me up and he said, "Look, I've got to do a speech about NATO." I said, "What do they want you to talk about NATO for?" He says, "I don't know. It's because I'm James Bond. They think I know something about the Cold War. I don't know anything about the Cold War." So isn't this a sad commentary on the fact that the generals who make up NATO believe that Pierce Brosnan is an expert on the Cold War? But they do. So I wrote a speech condemning NATO, which he read, which they weren't too happy about. Because the media is only interested in four things. The media is not interested in facts and figures. The media is not interested in education or statistics. The media is only interested in four things. And every story you read or see on television will have one of those four elements. And those elements are sex, scandal, violence, and celebrity. That's what the media is in the market of selling, and that's what every story is packaged within. And as an example to illustrate that, back in 1984, I led a campaign against the aerial shooting of wolves in British Columbia by the government of British Columbia. And we had a perfect media story. It had all four elements. And we were able to get that and therefore hold the headlines on this story for over 2.5 weeks. How we were able to do this is that first we had them shooting wolves, which is violent, from helicopters. We had them threatening to kill us if we intervened. So we had the violence thing down pretty good. We had a British Columbia Minister of the Environment took a $150,000 campaign contribution for the North American Wild Sheep Foundation in order to eradicate the wolves, 100%. So we had scandal when we were able to expose that. But scandal and violence, we needed the other two elements. So I was able to recruit Bo Derek as our spokesperson on that campaign. And the interesting thing is that at the press conference, a reporter for the Vancouver Sun in the front row said, "This is ridiculous. This is stupid. What do you have Bo Derek here talking about wolves for? What does she know about wolves?" I said, "Well, she doesn't know very much, really, but the fact is that you guys make the rules and we play the game. And if I had the best wolf biologist in the world, Dr. David Meck or Dr. Gordon Haber here, it would be an empty room. Nobody would be interested. But I see the room is full, and this story will be the front page story of your newspaper tomorrow, and there's not a goddamn thing you can do about it." And that's where it was. Right now they're making a $60 million motion picture about us. $60 million to make a movie about a campaign that cost me $25,000 to do. But that's Hollywood. And here's the interesting thing. Once Aidan Quinn, who will be playing me in the movie, is me, I will be real for the first time within the culture that we live in. Because in our culture, the only people who matter are celebrities. You know, if you want to be protected as a whale, you get a name like Willie or Keiko, and suddenly millions of dollars are being spent to protect you. Forget about all the other whales. That whale has to be saved because it has a name. A few years ago, I used to be an advisor for the Captain Planet series on Turner Broadcasting until I made the mistake of actually giving some advice, and then I was no longer welcome. But I attended a showing of the Captain Planet, a segment of Captain Planet at the Environmental Film Festival in Santa Monica, and the producer Barbara Pyle was there to show it, and there was 500 school children there to watch it, and she happened to pick the segment where Captain Planet was taking the law into his own hands and going out onto the high seas and sinking drift net boats and destroying drift nets to save whales, and she asked at the end if there was any questions, and I said, "Yes, Barbara." I said, "You've got Captain Planet and the Planeteers taking the law into their own hands and going out there and destroying property to protect life in the oceans. And I don't have any problem with that, but you're telling all these children here that it's perfectly all right to take the law into their own hands and go out there and destroy property to protect life, and, well, I don't have any problem with that either. But why is it when we as children grow up and become adults and we do what Captain Planet does, your network calls us eco-terrorists? Why are you supporting in fantasy something you will never support in reality?" Because the media defines our values. The media tells us what our solutions are. Why are we amazed when kids go into high schools and blow other students away, when that is the solution that's given on practically every motion picture and television show you see? You want to solve problems? Violence is the answer. That's what the media tells us, but that's a fantasy that they're selling. And let's not get it confused with reality, but since the media is defining reality, it does get very confusing. It defines our values completely. Imagine, if you will, go into the city of Mecca, walk into the main square, up to the black stone and spit on it. Well, your chances of walking out of that square alive are somewhat remote, and nobody will have much sympathy for you because you committed an act of blasphemy. You attacked something which was sacred, and people would support the violence that would be done against you. We're a very, very violent species. We are just discriminating in the violence that we support. Or walk into the city of Jerusalem, walk up to the Wailing Wall with a pickaxe and start hacking away. See how far you're going to get. You're going to get Israeli soldier's bullet in the back, and everybody's going to say you deserved it. You committed an act of blasphemy. You attacked something that was sacred to a particular group of people. Or walk into the Vatican and attack the P8, or better yet, rip the Pope's picture up on national television and see how people react to you. But each and every day, human beings go into the most profoundly mysterious and most exquisitely beautiful cathedrals in the world. The redwood forests of California, the Amazon rainforest, the temperate rainforests of Vancouver Island. All over the world they do this and totally desecrate and destroy these cathedrals with bulldozers and chainsaws. And how do we respond to that? Oh, a few people dress up in animal costumes and jump up and down and write to Congress. But you know, if those rainforests and the life within them was as valuable to us, was as sacred to us, meant as much to us as an old meteorite in Mecca or a decrepit old wall in Jerusalem or a hunk of cold marble in Rome, we would literally tear those loggers limb from limb for the act of blasphemy that they are committing. But we don't do it because we're alienated from the natural world. It's not part of our culture. It's not part of our life. And we don't understand it. We will kill. We will kill when we want something. You know, we killed 150,000 people in Iraq because we wanted oil. And I'll tell you right now, they're going to drill in the Arctic National Refuge. They are going to do it because as long as there is a drop of oil on this planet, it is like a drug and they're going to get it, and they don't care what they have to walk over to get it. And if you think you're going to stop them by demonstrations and jumping up and down and writing to Congress, you're not. As the recent little problems that have been happening in California have illustrated, that if California runs out of water and oil, they will kill every goddamn Canadian if they refuse to give it to them. And that is the reality that we have to deal with. There's this myth of nonviolence being the solution. And you know, the conservation environmental movement has been the best example of nonviolence in the history of any social movement in the world. Not one single person has ever been injured, let alone killed, by an environmentalist, by any member of a non-government organization. It has never happened. Yet, in the media, we're described as the militants and the eco-terrorists and the extremists. Meanwhile, environmentalists are murdered by the media. David Shane was murdered in California. Diane Fossey was murdered for protecting mountain gorillas. Chico Mendes was murdered in Brazil. On and on and on. There's just lists of them. Joy Adamson, George Adamson, Francisco Pereira, who was killed on the Rainbow Warrior when the French government blew it up and sunk it in New Zealand. Now there's an interesting example of the hypocrisy of the media and government. Not one Western leader condemned that as an act of terrorism. Not one editorial condemned that as an act of terrorism. And when it was brought up before Mrs. Thatcher, she said that, well, that's no concern of Great Britain. And when a member of Parliament said, well, it was a British ship with a British flag and a British captain and a British crew sunk in a British Commonwealth country by agents of the government of France, she said, I repeat, that is of no concern to Great Britain. But meantime, when an Argentine boat fires across the bow of a Korean fishing vessel 150 miles off the Falkland Islands, that is so much of concern to the British government, they send the whole damn Navy down there to kill people. So that is the hypocrisy that we have to deal with all the time. Personally, I'm glad that George Bush is president of the United States, and I'll tell you why. The strongest the environmental movement has ever been in this country was when Ronald Reagan was president and George Watts scared the bejesus out of us. And we realized that if we're going to protect this environment, if we're going to protect this planet, it's going to have to come from us, depend upon the government, never depend upon the government. They've never done anything, they never will. And Al Gore was nothing more than an illusion. Pro-WTO, pro-NAFTA, another born-again Christian. There's no difference between him and George Bush except for the marketing. It's the Demopublicans and the Republicans, whatever way you look at it. Personally, I was rooting for Dan Quayle. I figure America deserves Dan Quayle. But besides, I'm a conservative. You don't get more conservative than being a conservationist. The damn radicals out there trying to destroy this planet, polluting the oceans, cutting down the trees, killing off the animals. That is the radicals that we have to deal with. I'm constantly being criticized for my conservative views. Yes, I do oppose women engaged in the military. That's because I oppose anybody in the military. Yes, I do. I do oppose welfare. Those corporate welfare bums like Chrysler and General Motors and McDonnell Douglas have gotten away with the taxpayers' money for far too long. Let's put an end to this. And the law. I respect the law so much I uphold it continuously by breaking it. Because there are certain laws that mean more than other laws. Most importantly, the laws of ecology, the law of finite resources, the law of interdependence, the law of diversity of species. This is what is important. And any laws that try to subvert those natural laws are laws that must be challenged, because those three laws are the laws that guarantee our survival. You know, we hear a lot about, in the media, about jobs. You know, the spotted owl is responsible, 50,000, 100,000, 20,000, depends on which editorial you're talking about, how many logging jobs are lost because of the spotted owl. Everybody was real concerned about that. I wasn't concerned about it. I didn't give a damn about those people's jobs. I don't know why anybody would, because they don't care about your job. They certainly don't care about if you get laid off. Do you see an editorial in the paper about that? The same period of time, McDonnell Douglas, AT&T, IBM, and a few other corporations laid off 200,000 people in the interest of the shareholders of those corporations, and that was considered okay. We understand that. But for a bird, a species that's taken hundreds of millions of years to evolve, that will be obliterated from this planet, that we don't understand, nor do we accept. It's this hypocrisy of values. A few years ago, a ranger in Zimbabwe, a government ranger, shot and killed a poacher, and was severely criticized by human rights organizations for this. How dare he take a human life to protect an animal? That was the attitude. And he said, you know, in his answer to this really explained, I think, the problem. He said, you know, I don't understand why everybody's so upset. If I was a policeman in Harare and a man ran out of Barclays Bank with a bag of money and I shot him in the head in the main street in front of everybody and killed him, you'd all pin a medal on me and call me a hero. Why is it that a bag of paper has more value than the future heritage of the nation of Zimbabwe? Why is that? But we can't answer them because we all value paper over life. We see that all the time. Most of us spend our lives paying off this thing called a mortgage. If you translate that into Latin, it means contract on to death. Mort. We're all too busy waiting to die to be able to live. So the problem is that to get around the matrix, that is to get around the media, and the media defining to you what is reality, you really have to make your own reality. And you have to understand where your relationship is on this planet and how to defend that. It all comes to us in different ways. Back in 1975, on the first Greenpeace mission to protect whales, we encountered the Soviet whaling fleet 60 miles off the coast of Northern California. And we had come up with this great idea of putting inflatable rubber boats between the harpoons and the whales. We were reading a lot of Gandhi back then, and we really felt that they wouldn't risk killing a human being to take the life of a whale. Well, we certainly discovered that we were wrong very fast, and I found myself in a small inflatable boat with Bob Hunter. He and I were in this boat, and behind us, bearing down on us, a 150-foot steel harpoon vessel coming at us at 20 knots in very rough seas, and in front of us, 8 magnificent sperm whales that were fleeing desperately for their life. And every time the harpooner aimed that big harpoon cannon, I was able to maneuver the boat directly in front of the shot, and it worked for about 25 minutes. And then the captain came down the catwalk and he screamed into the ear of the harpooner and then looked at us and brought his finger across his throat like that, and then I knew that, you know, Gandhi wasn't really going to come through this time. And a few moments later, there was an incredible explosion, and this 150-pound grenade-tipped harpoon flew directly over our head and slammed into the back with a thud into a female sperm whale in the pod, and she screamed. And I had never heard a whale scream or even knew that a whale could scream, but it was an incredible, horrendous cry of pain. And suddenly the largest whale in this pod rose up and dove, his tail slamming the water, and disappeared. And we have been told by all of the experts, the scientists, that whale would attack us because we were the smallest target, and we'd all seen the woodcuts of the Yankee whaling boats being attacked on the high seas. So I can tell you it was with a great deal of anxiety that we sat there in a little rubber boat waiting for 50, 60 tons of very angry animal to come up underneath of us. And he did. The ocean erupted right behind us. And I turned in time to see this whale throw himself in the water straight at that harpooner. But he was waiting for him and very nonchalantly pulled the trigger and sent a second harpoon, this one unattached, at point-blank range, into the whale's head. And this whale screamed and fell back, thrashing and rolling on the water, his blood red everywhere around us. And as I was just transfixed, I couldn't move. And as the whale was rolling and thrashing about it, he caught my eye. And suddenly he dove and disappeared, and I saw a trail of bloody bubbles coming at us really fast. And this whale came up and out of the water at an angle over above our small little inflatable, blood and water pouring down all over us, so close I could have reached up and grabbed one of these 6-inch teeth, just ready to crush us completely. And I looked up into this eye the size of my fist, and what I saw in that eye changed my life forever, because I saw understanding. The whale understood what we were trying to do. Because the easiest thing for the whale to have done at that point was throw himself forward and crush us or seize us in his jaws, and did neither. Instead, with great deliberation and in pain, he slid back beneath the waves, eye-to-eye contact all the way, and died. That whale saved my life. I would be dead if it was not for that decision by that whale to spare me. And so ever since, I have been indebted to that whale, all whales, and I serve them, not you. So that's why I do what I do. Because I saw something else in that eye too, and it was pity. Not for himself, not for his kind, but for us, that we could commit such an act of blasphemy, that we could destroy life so thoughtlessly. And what for? Why were we killing those sperm whales? The Russians were killing them for one product, lubricating oil for ICBM missiles. We were killing off an intelligent species of animals for the purpose of manufacturing a weapon meant for the mass destruction of human beings. And that's when it came home to me completely that the human species was utterly and totally insane. And that is my opinion. I left Greenpeace shortly thereafter and set up the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, an organization that is not a protest organization, but upholds international conservation rules and regulations protecting marine wildlife. We operate under the auspices or the mandate of the United Nations World Charter for Nature, which states that any individual or NGO is empowered to uphold international conservation law. So when people say, I take the law into my own hands, in fact, I do have that to back me up. When I was arrested in Newfoundland in 1995 for chasing the Cuban and Spanish whaling fleets off of the Grand Banks and costing them $40 million in lost revenues, I was put on trial, and I was facing 2 times life plus 10 for saving fish. I was on trial same time as OJ. He was only doing 2 times. So after a 4-week trial, my defense was the UN World Charter for Nature, and it was accepted by the jury, and I was acquitted for that. Because I saw something else in that eye too, and it was pity. Not for himself, not for his kind, for us that we could commit such an act of blasphemy, that we could destroy life so thoughtlessly. And what for? Why were we killing those sperm whales? The Russians were killing them for one product: lubricating oil for ICBM missiles. We were killing off an intelligent species of animals for the purpose of manufacturing a weapon meant for the mass destruction of human beings. And that's when it came home to me completely that the human species was utterly and totally insane. And that is my opinion. I left Greenpeace shortly thereafter and set up the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, an organization that is not a protest organization, but upholds international conservation rules and regulations protecting marine wildlife. We operate under the auspices or the mandate of the United Nations World Charter for Nature, which states that any individual or NGO is empowered to uphold international conservation law. So when people say I take the law into my own hands, in fact I do have that to back me up. When I was arrested in Newfoundland in 1995 for chasing the Cuban and Spanish whaling fleets off of the Grand Banks and costing them $40 million in lost revenues, I was put on trial, and I was facing 2 times life plus 10 for saving fish. I was on trial same time as OJ. He was only doing 2 times. So after a 4-week trial, my defense was the UN World Charter for Nature, and it was accepted by the jury, and I was acquitted for that. In 1979, we chased down the pirate whaler, the Sierra. This is what they're making this motion picture about. I found it off the coast of Portugal, rammed it twice, and then we sank it in Lisbon Harbor. Didn't hurt anybody in the process. But we ended the career of that notorious pirate whaler once and for all. And when people say to me, you really ought to utilize education. You should be educating people. You shouldn't be doing these things. I said, well, that was an educational project. The harpooner, Knud Hoslad, who is a Norwegian harpooner, he appeared on NBC's Amazing Animals, being interviewed by Priscilla Presley. That's the real world. And she asked him, well, what do you think about your ship being rammed? And he said, well, it was the only way we could be stopped. And he said, what do you think about these eco-terrorists attacking you and taking away your livelihood? I mean, it's a pirate operation. But he said, I never really thought about whales before. They were just big fish. We killed them, we made lots of money. But when I saw that people were willing to go to that extent to protect them, I began to question what I was doing. And I'll never kill another whale again. And if Sea Shepherd wants me as a crew member, I'm ready to serve. Now, I can educate 300 million Americans to not kill whales, but they're not going to kill whales anyway, except for a few. But the fact is, to get one Norwegian harpooner to lay down that harpoon, I think, is a major educational achievement. In 1986, we sank half of Iceland's whaling fleet and destroyed their whale processing plant. That was $10 million in damages. That might sound like a crime. I was certainly accused of being a criminal. A lot of people called me that. The only problem is I couldn't get anybody to charge me with it. I got so frustrated that after a year I flew to Reykjavik to demand that they charge me. I was met at the airport by 150 police officers and the chief immigration officer, and he said, Captain Watson, how long do you intend to stay in Iceland? I said, I don't know, 5 days, 5 years, 5 minutes. I'm completely at your disposal. So they brought me into interrogation, and they say, are you admitting to sinking these ships? I said, well, we sunk them. We're going to sink the other 2 at the first opportunity. The next day, I was escorted to the airport, put on a plane, and flown to New York City. What I didn't know that morning was the Justice Minister stood up in the House of Parliament, and he says, who the hell does he think he is? He comes into our country and demands that we arrest him. Get him out of here. Because he knew that if I was put on trial, Iceland would be put on trial. That hunt was illegal, and they knew it. And we wanted to go to trial. We just couldn't get there. In 1990, I went out and rammed 2 Japanese drift netters in the North Pacific. They were just setting these 60,000 miles a net a day, just killing everything in sight, totally illegal. We rammed them, finally got their attention. 1,000 miles off the coast, I got a flyover by a U.S. Coast Guard plane, said, The State Department's just received a complaint that you attacked two of Japan's ships on the high seas. I says, absolutely right, yes we did. We have it on tape. And tell the State Department we're willing to cooperate 100%. 300 miles out the coast I was boarded by the U.S. Coast Guard Resolute, and they took statements and I gave them the tape. And they said, well, we'll see you in Seattle. I said, no, I hope so. And we came to Seattle, but never saw them again. Finally, after 2 weeks, I called up the FBI and I said, you know, what's a guy got to have to do to get arrested around here? I said, what's the problem? And they said, well, Japan's withdrawn their complaint. In fact, the Japanese position was that the incident never happened. It didn't occur. Even though our video footage is shown on Japanese news stations, the comment was, we're not aware of any such incident. Of course, I was attacked by people within our own movement. Shortly thereafter, a former colleague from Greenpeace came up and he said, I just want to let you know, Paul, that what you did in Iceland was despicable, reprehensible, criminal, and unforgivable. I said, well, so? I said, John, why do you think I care what you think? We didn't sink those whalers for you, John. We didn't sink them for you or any of the other 6 billion human beings on this planet. We sunk them for the whales, John. Find me one whale that disagrees with what we did and we will reconsider. So over the years we've sunk 9 whaling ships, 1 drift knitter, rammed numerous boats, rammed tuna boats off there. And as you see, as an eco-terrorist, I'm standing here before you. I'm not in jail. I've gone to jail a couple of times. You know, you have to go through that. Don't really trust anybody who hasn't been to jail, really. But, you know, was always able to win in the end because you have to look on the courtroom as a battleground also. And when I was arrested in Newfoundland, you know, people say, well, what'd you do to defend yourself? Did I go and get a public defender? Hell no. I got the biggest damn gun in St. John's, Newfoundland. Cost me a fortune, but you see, I'm standing here. I'm not in prison. If you've got enough money, you can make sure that you can get through on this. So always have a war chest, I'll tell you. Because if you want a lawyer, you better get a damn good lawyer when you're in a situation like that. Otherwise, they're going to crucify you. And this lawyer was an artist to behold. He just humiliated every government bureaucrat that came up before him, and I just had an incredibly enjoyable time in the courtroom. Right now, what Sea Shepherd is involved in, I have 1 ship in the Galapagos. We just arrived there in December. In fact, we're only 20 miles away from that oil spill when it happened, so we ended up spending a month rescuing marine iguanas and seals and birds from that. But what we're doing down there is we've entered into a 5-year agreement with the national parks of Galapagos. So my ship, the Cyrenian, is now an official patrol boat, anti-poaching patrol boat. And for the first time, we're armed. We carry arms now because we carry armed government rangers and Ecuadorian sailors. And what we're doing is arresting every poaching operation that we can come across. There are 2 patrol boats down there. We're patrolling the northern and western part of the islands, and the Guadalupe River is patrolling the south and the eastern parts. Poaching is out of control there, and if we can't save the Galapagos, something as pristine, something as unique as the Galapagos, then we have no hope in hell of saving anything else. So I look on this as a last stand, and it's something that we're committed for the next 5 years to be undertaking. If anybody is interested, by the way, in participating on those patrols, you're certainly welcome to volunteer to do so, because our crew members are all volunteers, and over the last 25 years we've had over 3,000 volunteer crew members on our ships participating in our campaigns. The other project that we're working on right now is called Project Sea Wings, and that is to get Grumman Albatross airplanes completely outfitted with the equipment to respond to and rescue birds and animals from oil spills. In the last 5 years, Sea Shepherd's been involved. In the last year, Sea Shepherd's been involved in 5 oil spill rescues. 1 on the coast of France, 1 in Turkey, 2 in Brazil, and this latest one in the Galapagos. And we found that in every case, it was too little done too late. That tanker that went on the reef in the Galapagos sat on that reef for 4 days without spilling a drop of oil. While that was happening, the U.S. Coast Guard had been called. But the Ecuadorian government was demanded by the U.S. demanded $600,000 to send the Coast Guard down there, and Ecuador didn't want to pay. So they spent 4 days fighting over the price. And as soon as the oil hit the water, then they were on the plane and they were down there. But this is a World Heritage Site. What's the United States arguing about who's going to pay for the cost on it? But that's what they were doing. The other thing we found is that we could have started pumping, but we were told right away by the Ecuadorian Navy, if we touched 1 drop of that oil, we would be charged a theft of Petroecuador property. And so we were prevented by the Navy from doing anything. So I can tell you it's very frustrating to sit there for 4 days watching and knowing that tanker was going to break up, and there was nothing that could be done about it. So that's why we're trying to organize now an air rescue team that we want 4 teams worldwide that can respond to any oil spill anywhere in the world in within 12 hours with the equipment needed to protect birds. And most of this is out of sight and out of mind. The Erika spill on the coast of France last year killed over 400,000 seabirds, but most people never heard about it. It wasn't really played up that big. And our other big campaign this year is to take 2 vessels down to the Antarctic whale sanctuary to confront and stop the Japanese whaling fleet. So we'll be heading down there in November and December to do that. You know, the strength of an ecosystem is dependent upon the diversity of species within it, and the strength of a movement is dependent upon the diversity of approaches within it. And so if the environmental and conservation movement is to be strong, it is going to be strong because of that diversity. Unfortunately, there's a new business which has sprung up. It's called the feel-good business. Organizations that you can join to feel good. And what these are doing is taking it all away from you and saying, oh, we'll solve this problem. Just send us 25 bucks. You know, just send us 100 bucks. We'll solve the problem. You know, Greenpeace, and this is the only organization I will criticize because I feel somewhat like Dr. Frankenstein. I helped create the monster. But, you know, Greenpeace would spend, like 3 years ago, spent $49 million sending out 37 million pieces of junk mail. Now, how can you call yourself an environmental organization and spend that kind of money and those resources to send out junk mail for a 1.3% return? That's what they get, because the mathematics works. It's all business. So the people who run Greenpeace and the other big organizations today are business people, accountants, fundraisers. You don't want any activists in these organizations. They just get in the way of the fundraising. As David Brower found when he built up the Sierra Club, he wasn't too welcome in it because he was actually doing something. So he founded Friends of the Earth, and of course they kicked him out of there. And he said, you know, Earth Island will probably kick me out of here sometime too, because it's almost invariably organizations become too conservative for their founders. I personally don't believe that organizations are the answer. Certainly governments aren't the answer. Margaret Mead, who was an early advisor to Sea Shepherd, said that the only thing that has made any significant change over the years are the actions of individuals, the passion of individuals. And if you look at any social revolution throughout our history, you will find that that is the case. It wasn't the United States government that ended slavery in the United States. It was the passion of Wilberforce. It was the initiatives of Douglass. It was individuals who made a difference. The Mahatma Gandhis of the world. It was Diane Fossey. Because of her that mountain gorillas were protected in Rwanda. And the interesting thing about it is that she was hamstrung by the 2 organizations that were supporting her. She raised tens of millions of dollars for the World Wildlife Fund and National Geographic, and they gave her peanuts. And when she threatened to get heavy with the poachers, they threatened to cut her off. And this is the problem, is that individuals aren't getting the support from these large organizations who are certainly capitalizing on their efforts. And it was because of David Wingate, a government biologist in the island of Bermuda, that the Bermuda storm petrel, the cowhau, is alive today. It would be extinct if it wasn't for that one man. And I cannot think of a greater and more significant legacy that anybody can leave is because you lived, a species of plant or animal continued to survive. I mean, that is something that will last way into the future, millions of years into the future. And that's where we'll be judged. We will be judged by the future, because to be a conservationist is to be part of the continuum of life. And it is not to be concerned about what this is going to be, the world is going to be like in 10 years or 100 years. But everything that we're doing right now is going to have a significant impact on the kind of world we're going to be having here 100,000 years from now, 100 million years from now. Every species we drive into extinction sends a ripple forward into the future, which has incredibly negative impact. And we have to understand that is our real commitment, our real objective is to make sure that the continuum of life on this planet continues to survive. Most people don't think much into the future, you know, not very many years into the future, and it's very, very frustrating. They don't know where they came from, and therefore they don't know who they are. And because they don't know who they are, they don't know where they're going. And that's a lesson that we can certainly learn from Aboriginal peoples around the world. You know, I remember in Australia one time, and I ask this to people all the time, this question: what was your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's name? The year's 1550. What was her name? Nobody knows. Nobody cares. Why? It's not part of their reality. But I found in the outback of Australia an Aboriginal who can answer that question. And also give me details about her life. Because there was a man who knew where he came from. And therefore he knew who he was and where he was. And therefore a child born 700 years from now was very much a part of his reality. He'll never see the child in the flesh, but the knowledge of that child will exist was sufficient for him to act and be concerned. And this is what we have to be concerned about, is that tomorrow will only be possible if we act today. And we have to get away from this media culture that defines our reality. As poet Leonard Cohen once said, you know, we're locked into our suffering, and our pleasures are the seal. We're so busy feeling good, so busy entertaining ourselves, that we're not doing anything about the problem. The Romans understood that perfectly. Give the people bread and circuses. And that's what we're getting today, bread and circuses. Everything from dope to alcohol to sitcoms on television to massage your mind so they can sell you more crap. That is the bread and circuses that we're getting. So is it any wonder that Alfred E. Newman is President of the United States? Media philosopher Marshall McLuhan once predicted, he said, you know, it will get to the point in the U.S. where you will not become president unless you are an actor or an entertainer. He said that in 1968. And when Ronald Reagan became president, that certainly brought that home. I was talking to Martin Sheen last week, and I said, because he's on our board of advisors, I said, Martin, why don't you run for president? After all, many people think you're president. And Martin's not a stupid man. He said, you know, if I did, they'd kill me before I walked through that door. Because who is President of the United States, Prime Minister of Canada, Prime Minister of Britain, President of France, is well defined before you ever go into to put your ballot in the voting booth. It's picked well in advance, and you can go through the illusion that you're electing these people, but that's all it is. It's an illusion. You don't get your real choice. You saw what happened when Ralph Nader made the bid, you know, did a great job, you know, spoke up for what he believed in, but nobody wanted to listen to Ralph Nader. First of all, they were prevented by not participating in the debates, but that's no excuse. People who wanted to could hear him. But the fact is that they didn't want to hear what he had to say because it upset their world. Everybody in this country is an environmentalist until it comes to sacrificing something that is a luxury. Then suddenly you ain't an environmentalist anymore. So what we're going to find in the future is as the situation deteriorates, that there's going to be more oppression against the environmentalist community. And that is going to happen. People are going to suffer because of it. And in the long run, the world I was born in had 3 billion people in it. Today it's over 6 billion. In 50 years it will be 12 billion. In 100 years, it will be 24 billion. 200 years, 48 billion. Somewhere in that 200-year period, there's going to be a collapse. And is this the kind of world that we want to be part of or give to our children? A world in a state of ecological collapse? Because I can tell you right now, if you think about it, if you look into it, that an ecological collapse will make all of the wars and all of the famines and all of the pestilences throughout the history of this planet pale in insignificance. It will seem like a picnic compared to what that will be. Because when you find that 90% of your population dies within 12 months and the rest are fighting over turnips and potatoes, and you'll see just how fast we can fall back into barbarism. And everything that we've done will be lost and forgotten because we didn't have the foresight to look into the future and see what the consequences of our actions were today. Thank you.
Seal Osiju. Hello, my relatives. It's good to see you here. I'd like to thank those who brought this together, this gathering, these people, to express how honored I feel to be able to present the presence of my auntie, Carrie Dunn, my uncle Corbin Harney, and I'd like to express my appreciation to the indigenous people whose land this is for allowing it to happen. My name, as was said, is Ward Churchill. That was the name I was given. I'm of the Kituwa Band of Cherokee Bear Clan. My father's lineage of the Muskogee, the Creek, the people of the Red Stick. By way of my marriage to Kishi Babanijik, I am Lynx Clan Ojibwe from Onigami, Kinese, and Kijinabe. But I've been instructed to bring you the greetings of both clans and of the Colorado chapter of the American Indian Movement. And from Gorthy Las, otherwise known as Leonard Peltier, who tonight as I speak to you, still, despite the fact that Mark Rich never has to worry about appearing in a federal court, sits in a cage at the federal prison, Leavenworth, Kansas, not for anything anyone, including his prosecutor, at any point in the last 10 years is willing to say they were aware he did, but rather as a symbol of the arbitrary ability of the federal government of the United States to repress the legitimate aspirations to liberation of indigenous peoples everywhere within its claimed boundaries. Leonard Peltier. I had intended to come here and speak to the issues of internal colonialism in the United States and the relationship between the structure of that and environmental devastation. I had intended to focus upon uranium mining. Not that that is the be-all, end-all of the internal colonial process and the profit derivative therefrom, but it's a good example, at least as good as any. And it has a broad impact. I had intended to go to the nature of a decolonization struggle being waged with respect to the indigenous nations of North America as being absolutely essential to any envision of environmental justice and indeed ecological survivability. And I do not wish to abandon that. But the nature of tonight's proceedings was something I was not informed of, really, until about 2 weeks ago, and then by happenstance, mutual friend of Paul Watson and myself in Seattle asked me, "How did you manage to set this up?" And I said, "Say what?" "Did you get in the same forum with Paul?" And I said, "Say what?" And here we are. So the nature of the talk has changed a little bit. And to Paul, I'd like to say, good job. Good job. You stole part of my speech, as a matter of fact. The self-absorption of the human species, the arrogant and insufferable sense of separateness from the natural order, standing not only apart from but above. The unspeakable ineffectuality of confronting a structurally violent situation with professions of nonviolence, prayer vigils in the face of cannons and harpoons. The function and the impact of the media, the master narrative and the hegemony, the process by which it is explained to us virtually from birth how it is that that which we encounter, no matter how insane and irrational, is not only right, but natural and inevitable. And the nature of the packaging by which this occurs, and ultimately the tactical necessity, at least on occasion, of we ourselves engaging in these processes in order to command media attention. You don't ask for media attention. You don't persuade the purveyors of media, the corporate entities that command and control the media, to provide you with a public forum on the basis of the merits of your issues and your arguments. You utilize the methods by which they compel attention to themselves to compel a subpart of that attention be focused on you. That it becomes important to shift the nature of my commentary tonight. And there was something conspicuously left out of what it was that was said by the previous presenter, which was that in this part of the world is very busily engaged in opposing the taking of 4 gray whales each year by Makah fishermen in compliance with a treaty obligation to protect those rights on a part of the United States of America entered into in 1855. There's some implications to that we must learn from it. But to learn from it, we must understand the nature of the phenomenon, the nature of the manipulation that went into making that seem to be, at least for a period of time up here, a plausible position, resonating very favorably with a good, substantial, at least, portion of the population. And there were some anticipated sectors of resonance. Slade Gordon, for example, thought it was all great. Some of the hardest rightist, anti-Indianist, pro-whalingist, industrialist, anti-environmentalist slugs that have ever been generated in the Northwest thought it was a great idea. We could expect that. But the resonance extended into other quarters as well, and some of those were not quite so expected. And the reason for that has to do with something that was written, kind of like the whale ramming stories, something that was long enough ago or far enough away that it was not anticipated that a whole lot of people would be able to question the validity of it one way or another. And that's one of the problems with the speech. See, I bought into it, and I would still continue to buy into everything in that talk that was given that was true, but it's impossible to separate what is true from what is false, what is said for effect, in order to peddle the ware. Even though the principle may be good, you need to be about the business of truth in order to build a movement that is sustainable. This is a chapter from an autobiography written by Paul Watson, one of the several autobiographies as what was a self-aggrandizing and important individual has managed to author in the process of his career, in which it was explained there's a much younger individual in 1973, a Canadian national as I take it, traversed the distance from the approximate location of Vancouver to the approximate location of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and attempted to go in overland to join the American Indian Movement occupation force that was supporting the traditional Oglala Lakota assertion of sovereignty, actually reassertion of sovereignty that was occurring there at that time. That's a while ago. Actually, it was before a lot of the people who were hearing the message or reading the book or trying to make sense of the opposition to Makah whaling even born, so it's a matter of ancient history in that sense. And it's in South Dakota, which is a fair distance away from here, an area which is not greatly focused upon by much of the population of the United States at any point anyway, fairly safe. But this is a fairly significant event. It's entered into the mythology of Americana. So we've got Paul hiking through the snow in South Dakota trying to join his brothers inside the occupation zone, being arrested by a team of FBI agents and returned post-haste to Pine Ridge Village, from whence he sets out once again to enter Wounded Knee and is arrested once again and is informed that he is being deported within 24 hours as a foreign national in the United States at a time of, I think, national emergency is how it was put. Whereupon the light bulb comes on and he goes into the press line, those being issued credentials, and is issued a press card as a reporter for the Vancouver Sun, which he wasn't. Good move, assuming it happened. And then was admitted into the siege zone along with other members of the press, and immediately throws away the press card, volunteers his service, and becomes essentially a combat medic. Is on the other end of the stretcher from Rocky Madrid, who was a medic at Wounded Knee out of Alamosa, Colorado, when Rocky was shot in the stomach by a federal sniper, and then proceeded along with, from the Rosebud Reservation, Leonard Crow Dog, to extract the bullet, and was consequently taken into a sweat lodge by Wallace Black Elk, my father, naturalized as an Oglala under the authority of Crow Dog, and given the name, what is it, Gray Wolf Clearwater. Having become an Oglala Lakota and experiencing a vision in the sweat lodge at Wounded Knee that his mission in life would be essentially the counterpart of an Oglala in a central part of the United States, to save the mammals of the sea. I've heard it put the buffalo of the sea, which of course would of course be the whales. He's been doing it ever since, essentially as an Indian. So it's not that there's this white guy, environmentalist, out there in a boat trying to disrupt Makah treaty rights. Understand, figuratively at least, it's an Indian, made such by virtue of participating in a struggle for indigenous sovereignty in South Dakota in a generation ago, standing on treaty rights as was happening in South Dakota, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. You got nothing to tell him about treaties and treaty rights. He's been fighting for those all his life. He's in fact more Indian than the Indians, and said so. And said so. Well, that may play real well in Robert Bly's men's movement. But it doesn't play so well in South Dakota. It's just that no one pays much attention to what is said in South Dakota. But what was it that was said in South Dakota about that? Instant credibility spun out in terms of media impact by the savior of the buffaloes of the sea. The short version is, and I'll take it chapter and verse, none at all. None at all. Since it was Wallace Black Elk's name that was mentioned, I asked my father, Wallace, did this happen? He said, what? Did you hold a sweat for a man named Paul Watson and make him responsible for the well-being of the whales? And he said, what? Now Wallace is getting old. All he was getting was confused. So I looked through this a little more closely, and I said, did you convey a name? Did you convey a name on someone in the sweat lodge? And he said, we don't convey names in the sweat lodge, which I knew already. I said, Gray Wolf Clearwater. And then he really looked confused. He said, that's two people. We don't have first and last names. And Clearwater was the name of Frank Clearwater, who was a man, a Cherokee man at Wounded Knee, who was shot, a warrior who died. He was a real person, but he was not Paul Watson. He was not Paul Watson. It's an honorable name, a warrior name. But to be a medic at Wounded Knee would be to be a non-combatant, and a warrior's name would never be bestowed on a non-combatant. It would be a disrespect of the fallen warrior. That would be the tradition there. From the people who had the tradition. This was supposedly done under the authority of Leonard Crowdog, to whom Wallace Black Elk was at the time a spiritual apprentice. So I asked Leonard, whom I also know. He knew nothing about it. I have here a letter from Carter Camp, who was at the time the national chairperson of the American Indian Movement, was the first American Indian Movement leader into Wounded Knee, the last American Indian Movement leader out. He was every day on the ground, and that's not true of everybody. There were people who were in, there were people who were out. They were there part of the time, not there part of the time. It would be possible, in the case of Russell Means, for example, whose name is also listed as someone who could corroborate this as having been true, that after Russell left, although if this occurred after Russell left, I don't know how he could be listed as a corroborator to it, but it would be possible for Paul Watson to have been at Wounded Knee when Russell Means was not. That is not the case with Carter Camp. Carter uses a four-letter word to describe it. That four-letter word is liar. Straight up. This is not to say that Paul Watson was not at Wounded Knee. There were periods when ceasefires were called when the federal authorities who were besieging the Wounded Knee occupation zone, as it was called, actually a besieged community, and there were people who were allowed in. He perhaps was in at that time. However, during the periods of time when people who were not participants in defense of the Wounded Knee community were on the scene, sweat lodges were not run. Naturalization as an Oglala would of course be performed by Oglalas. It is said that the naturalization of Paul Watson, which made him a member of the Oglala people and consequently a naturalized American Indian, was performed by Leonard Crowdog and by Wallace Black Elk, both of whom are Sikangu Lakotas, Brule, another people related but not Oglalas. And in any event, the naturalizations that did in fact occur, because there were naturalizations of allies that occurred at Wounded Knee, were the Vietnam Veterans Against the War contingent of 7 individuals. They were performed by the responsible political authority that would do that, the traditional leader, Frank Foolscrow, chief, not by a healer or a medicine man, so-called. Now, those 7 individuals, I know 2 of them. Names were bestowed. You want 2 of them? Bobby Anderson became White Bob. Another individual whose identity I won't divulge here tonight became Honky Killer. Nothing noble sounding like Gray Wolf, Clearwater. I've talked to Stan Holder. I have not talked to Dennis Banks. Russell Means is my adopted brother. He says it's a sick joke. And I've also talked to the medics. Ron Rosen, who was one of the medics shot at Wounded Knee, who was there the whole time, never heard of you. Rocky Madrid, who was supposedly on the other end of the stretcher, never heard of you. So what is this about? It's establishing credibility to make a point which is extrapolated from a basis of ignorance and defiance of indigenous rights, which I would argue would be natural rights, towards what presumptively is a greater good, but then greater good is something that Native people have been hearing about from great white fathers who anoint themselves to exalted positions under false pretenses since Christopher Columbus landed half a world away from where he thought he was in the Caribbean 500 years ago. Half a world away from where he thought he was, getting himself known as the great navigator, an admiral of the ocean sea, a naval ranking not particularly distinguishable other than in a hierarchical sense from that of captain, and he wore a funny suits too. And the reason he did it as you do it is to command media attention, dressing up in funny little suits and claiming naval ranks in order to assign oneself importance within the hierarchy that one purports to oppose, in some way speaks to itself as it bespeaks of vastly deficient self-concept and sense of self-esteem. It is compensated for by making up an identity which is not properly yours. And we need to be clear, and clarity cannot be found in falsehood, no matter how compelling it may be. No matter how compelling it may be. Now, the greater good to be served here, in fact, in some ways could be described as such. There is no question that industrial whaling has had a significant and perhaps, if it were continued, irreparable impact on the gray whale population. There is no question about that. And defending the gray whale against the ravages of Japanese and Russian and Norwegian whalers to the extent that you actually did what you said you did is something I would right now commend you for. But to make a false equivalency between industrial whaling for ICBM missiles or any other purpose on the one hand and the subsistence whaling of traditional whalers on the other is absurd. And the whaling convention that you cite, if it was not directed at the industrial whalers rather than the subsistence whalers, if it in fact made the same false equivalency, was something that you should cite with regard to the industrial whalers and be very clear in making the distinction yourself from the subsistence people. But the argument that was made was that the Makah whaling, taking a four gray whales guaranteed by treaty, constituted a slippery slope, that if the Makahs were allowed to do it, it would, in essence, breach the binding effect of the whaling convention and open the way for the resumption of activities by the major whalers, was in itself false, despite the fact that the Japanese tried to capitalize on exactly the ground you said they would. If it is indeed believed by those in the non-indigenous environmental movement that there are aspects of treaty guarantees which are now, because of changed historical circumstance, invalid on the basis that they are not sustainable, it must be remembered that these are pre-existing treaty relationships between nations and that they are reciprocal in nature. What the Makah did in 1855 was cede a considerable proportion of their territory on land in exchange for a perpetual guarantee of their right to take whales. If you wish to abrogate the right to take whales, then the quid pro quo is reversed, and I do not hear you arguing for the restitution of the land. To abrogate the guarantee of the right to take whales without a concomitant argument for the restitution of the land is to argue to the nullification of the treaty right in its entirety and the nullification of the Makahs as a nation of people existent in the world. Biodiversity includes cultural diversity and national autonomy. We need to lay out some principles, and these go back to the ones that I had anticipated addressing anyway. First has to do with truthfulness between one another. If we can't at least arrive at that position of mutual respect, if we are falsifying the nature of our own behavior, our own background, in order to establish a credibility to speak in a voice that is not ours to speak in, we have no hope of communication between one another on the basis of respect that will allow us to forge a viable movement that can oppose corporate power, that can oppose state power, that can allow us to reconstitute, reorganize ourselves as peoples in this world and a part of this world in coexistence with the rest of the natural environment in the fashion that indigenous peoples have done since time immemorial. We need a call for first principles, and the first principles will have to go to first peoples as a matter of first priority. Let me put it to you in just plain blunt English. My elders sitting here are the most bombed nation on this planet. Niue Segovia, Western Shoshone, over 1,000 nuclear detonations within the 1863 Ruby Valley Treaty territory, considerable amount of mining, devastation of the environment because it's not otherwise useful to the dominant society, to the dominant culture, within that framework, that perspective that extrapolates humans as God on earth, separate, apart, above nature, to dominate nature. All on the first page of Genesis. Had the 1863 Ruby Valley Treaty been honored, had the citizenry, the non-native citizenry of the United States compelled their government to abide by the law, that would not have happened. The Shoshones did not bomb themselves. The Shoshones are not engaged in nuclear research and testing. The Shoshones are not engaged in gold mining. They're not digging up molybdenum. They are not draining the aquifer. They are not doing any of that. The Makahs did not establish an industrial whaling enterprise, nor do I understand that they have any intent to. Were the St. Regis Mohawks in sovereign possession of their land, you would not have Reynolds aluminum devastating the landscape up there. Let's put it this way. In pursuing the rights of First People, in terms of fulfilling your citizenly responsibilities to compel, by whatever means are necessary, your government, your representatives, to fulfill its fundamental legal obligations in its relationships with indigenous peoples to unoccupy our territory, roll back the illegal occupation, end the usurpation of our legitimate governments, and all the rest of that rhetoric that George Herbert Walker Bush put forth with regard to Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf in 1990. You are taking, in material terms, component parts of the United States out of itself. Not only 35% of its aggregate territory, but 66.5% of its domestic claimed uranium reserves, 25% of its low sulfur coal, 20% of its natural gas and oil, bauxite, copper, so on. You're dismantling not only the geographical corpus of the United States if you pursue that agenda, but you're taking apart the resource profile that allows it to operate in economies of scale, creating the monstrosity of a system that we all are forced to confront today with the concomitant environmental impacts. Does that make sense to you? They should be laying it out in this law school in American Indian or federal Indian law, as they put it. They should be making you read Kapler. What is Kapler? Kapler is simply the compilation of the text of the 371 bilateral ratified by the Senate treaties between indigenous nations on the one hand and the federal government of the United States on the other. It's an incomplete collection, but it's a good start. Get yourself familiar with those. Get yourself familiar with your legal obligations in terms of citizenship, and you will, as a matter of concomitance, as I keep using that word, it connects, okay, to an agenda that is self-defining, readily identifiable at any rate, to begin to take apart that which is the point of opposition, that which we oppose as people who are environmentally conscious beings who want to leave for our children and our children's children and our children's children's children, 7 generations down into the future, a world which is at least as habitable and hopefully more so than the one we inherited as children when we came into this world. There is a coincidence between that script, which is readily transmittable in your text on the one hand, and the traditional knowledge that was being talked about by Corbin Harney and by Kerry Dan today. Those two understandings are in perfect coincidence there on the basis of those treaties and those treaties' relations, because it was a set of circumstances that were agreed to mutually between your ancestors, your, in the sense of the United States on the one hand, and their ancestors generations before. At Fort Laramie in 1868, at Ruby Valley in 1863, with the Makah in 1855, and all the way back to 1787. They agreed to it, we agreed to it, and it was mutually agreeable because it was something that laid out the framework of a sustainable arrangement between peoples. And to sustain a relationship between peoples, it is absolutely essential, as Paul Watson put out, that you sustain a relationship with the environment that allows the environment to still be there when you're done. The script is there, but you don't fulfill that script by trying to nullify and negate the obligations that attend both individuals and statist entities within the corpus of the modern industrial society with respect to the acquisition of its land base, its jurisdictional prerogatives over indigenous resources, and its absolute minimum requirement to deal with Native peoples with respect. And that's all ultimately we were talking about at any point in the historical interaction between the two. The need for truth and the need for respect. And if we can get those two cardinal elements in place, at least among the people in this room, the constituencies that are represented by the people in this room, we have a fighting chance to get something done that goes in the right direction. And if not, not. If it's just all glib and whatever plays best in glitz and media terms and ability to interact and talk with Martin Sheen and other people, hey, we are who we oppose. You need to let that one percolate a little bit, think about it. But I'd like to thank you for listening to this point. Hopefully we can have some interaction between you and me and the other presenters for the balance of the time available, which is a little over a half an hour, so talk to us.
At this point in time, I guess we can open up the discussion if there's questions to be asked of the speakers or if the speakers would like to speak themselves. Then fire away.
Paul Watson, any comments?
Before we begin this, we are under time constraints, so keep your questions.
I'll be brief. I certainly do have a comment. The fact is that we do not discriminate against whalers. I don't care what culture or race they are. If they are breaking IWC regulations, we oppose them. And the Makah hunt is not recognized by the International Whaling Commission. There is a treaty, and it's with the United States. Internationally, that is the rules that govern the protection of whaling. The United States abrogated the treaty with the Makah when they signed the treaty with the International Whaling Commission, and the Makah should sue them for it. But the fact is that the... What's that?
What will you do to support that?
Well, I'll tell you what we're doing right now. We're supporting the very thing that he mentioned about giving land back in trade. This is an initiative that we actually put forward. And when Ward said that that's something we should do, he's obviously not aware of the fact that that's something that we've actually been promoting for many years now. And the fact is that there was discussion about commercial whaling amongst the Makah, and we have the documents through the Freedom of Information Act to prove it. There is also the fact that this is not a hunt for cultural necessity, and that is why it was not given the permission by the International Whaling Commission, for subsistence necessity. It's what they call cultural necessity. If that kind of precedent is set, then nothing is safe. Rainforests will come down, endangered species will be taken because cultural necessity. The Japanese are the aboriginal inhabitants of Japan. Norwegians are the aboriginal inhabitants of Norway, and they're using the same argument, and this fit right into their argument. The Japanese at the IWC, the first thing they said was, can somebody please explain what the difference is between cultural necessity for Japan and cultural necessity for the Makah. So that's the thing. And I just want to address one final thing here. There's an accusation that I was not at Wounded Knee. I was at Wounded Knee, and all the people that you mentioned I met, and they knew that I was there. I think that you should sue me, and I will present the evidence in a court. Sue me. Because I've been presenting my evidence, and you obviously don't want to. I got photographs of myself there. You don't want to listen to this. You want to believe. In other words, you're just as capable of revisionism as any other peoples, and that's my point. We're all the same, regardless of our race, our culture, and everything. We all have our own self-interest. That's what it's all about. And by the way, I do wear the cute little uniform for the media.
Not to say that we're not engaging in productive dialogue here, and speaker at the mic. There's a mic here. Oh,
I have a question. It's directed towards Ward. My question is, you talked at the beginning of your speech about the situation with Paul and the problems with having sort of these falsified or even true egos come to dominate in a movement. And you were saying, you know, the cardinal elements need to be respect and truth. And my consistent finding is not so much that people are making up backgrounds for themselves, but more that ego is such a huge impediment to the work that we need to do. And I don't see how the cardinal elements of truth and respect address that when our movement is so torn consistently by not just Paul or any other individual, but the phenomena of ego and perpetuated through media, the cult of personality.
To a certain point, I agree with you. But in order to pursue that which is a natural condition, you are imbued with an ego. How that manifests itself in the world is a matter of some conscious choice. Now, there are these interesting and somewhat anomalous situations where the media picks someone who's essentially not interested in being a media figure, but usually you've got to cultivate it. And it can actually be an effective tactic, but it's a dangerous tactic, and that's what I was trying to get to in the beginning, particularly when you wrap a movement in the need to acquire or command media attention. You can lose sight of what the truth is yourself. So we have to sort of check one another on it, and that's a little bit of the process that was going on tonight. Now, I did not say that Paul Watson was not at Wounded Knee. I think if you'll think back to what I actually said, is it was possible that he went into Wounded Knee during one of the periods of ceasefire, when the press, and sometimes others as well, were allowed in there. But the sorts of things that he said happened while he was in there didn't occur during those periods, and I draw into question whether or not they happened at all. And I know the individuals in question. And I'm hard-pressed to accept an interpretation that says they're all uniformly lying and that only Paul Watson's telling the truth. I'm sorry. It stretches credibility. With regard to your pressing for Makah land rights, you're right. I was unaware of that. Somehow, the one position came out very clearly, Paul, and somehow the other position hasn't come out at all. And I watch for these things. So you need to brush up on your media skills, hone it so that you're getting as much attention on your affirmative agenda as on your negative agenda here. But on that particular one, if that's a serious thing on your part and not something contrived for effect here tonight, you can consider me an ally in it, and I'll work on it with you. But I got to make one other response for standing down here, is that the ICW doesn't mean squat absent consent of the Makah, who are a nation bilaterally recognized as such, and the Vienna Law of Conventions indicates that no nation has a prerogative of unilaterally abrogating a treaty relation with another without restoring the quid pro quo, and in fact it cannot nullify the sovereign posture of another nation as a concomitant to its treaty relationship in another capacity. So the United States would be an invalid signatory following your line of reasoning here, which doubly invalidates the binding effect of the Whaling Convention. I don't think you want to go there, because you're opening the door to the Japanese and other people to make the same arguments.
International treaty takes precedence over bilateral treaties.
All treaties, by definition, Paul, are international instruments. Even under the Constitution of the United States, the negotiation and ratification of a treaty with another party conveys de facto recognition of the fully sovereign national status of the second party. And that's international customary law as well. There is nothing about sui generis treaties in the law.
What about the question? And what about the ego wars you're waging right now? What happened to the question?
I'm I'm sorry if information actually constitutes ego, but maybe you're in the wrong venue if you think so.
If we're going to continue this dialogue, I would request that we refrain from interjecting sporadically and address questions one at a time.
I've got a couple of questions for both our speakers.
I just have a comment, and this isn't so much for the speakers as it is for all of us, that this is the kind of thing that divides our movement. A lot of us are here in solidarity, and I think that there are issues and events that have happened that have caused a division, such as the Makah is a rather large one, and it really saddens me to see us here bickering, human beings bickering about things, and I don't think that that's why I'm here. I'm here to find out solutions to what I can do to help my Mother Earth, and I don't want to see human beings bickering about how we're helping her, and I'd just like to see us love and treat each other with a little more respect and a little more peace.